He's saying to Europe, to NATO, he's calling their bluff. He's saying this is what it will take to ensure that you in turn are not attacked. Will you do it? And this new notion about recognizing temporarily that the occupied territories are under Russian control, not ceding them, but recognizing the reality that we're not going to get them back in the near future, is in a way just a way of getting attention to the fact that these are intractable issues which need a European and North American, ideally, commitment to long-term security for Ukraine instead of just looking for a way out of the war.
Ukraine's President Zelensky has suggested he'd cede territory under Russian control in exchange for, well, NATO membership or an arrangement with NATO. Zelensky said the umbrella of NATO would have to be offered to unoccupied parts of the country to end the hot phase of the war, as he put it. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is in Kyiv meeting the Ukrainian leader. And to discuss the prospects of peace in Ukraine, let's talk to Keir Giles, the Ukrainian MP, leader of the Holos Party. Welcome to you, Keir.
Hello, John, and thank you so much for having me.
Always welcome, Keir. And also welcome to Keir Giles, who's a senior consulting fellow with the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. Hello to you, Keir.
Hello, good evening, John.
Evening to you. Keir, can I start with you? So we have Zelensky talking openly for the first time of peace, freezing the conflicts, some sort of guarantee from NATO for Ukraine. What are your thoughts on what you heard from President Zelensky, Keir?
Well, I think all the discussions about Ukraine's position, they are all bumping into one question that we have discussed with you many, many times, John. This question is who or what in the world can make sure that in any kind of deal, Putin will keep his part of the bargain. As of right now, we haven't heard that Russia would be happy to negotiate or ready to negotiate, and we have not heard of any plans of making sure that Russia would not attack us again. We are not speaking right now some ideas. We are talking about facts. Like we had the ceasefire agreement with Russia since 2014, and we know that it was never kept. And we know that since that time, there were more than 200 negotiations regarding what to do next. And it just never worked. It allowed Russia to strengthen itself, to build more factories and weaponry and attack us at a full-scale invasion in 2022. So right now, any discussions that may be happening and any ideas about peace that are being flowing around, they are bumping into this key question of how would you make it work?
Right. I mean, as you say, we've talked many times about Vladimir Putin and how far it's possible or not possible to trust what he says. Keir Giles at Chatham House, what do you say about that? That's a very relevant question, is it? What Putin would mean by striking some sort of peace now?
Well, that's exactly right. And the key question, as Keir Giles just said, is how to make sure that the war does not resume, how to ensure that Putin is not just taking advantage of an end to major combat operations to build up his armed forces even faster for the next attack, whether it's on Ukraine or some other part of Europe. And that, in a way, is what Zelensky is laying on the table. He's saying to Europe, to NATO, he's calling their bluff. He's saying this is what it will take to ensure that you, in turn, are not attacked. Will you do it? And this new notion about recognizing temporarily that the occupied territories are under Russian control, not ceding them, but recognizing the reality that we're not going to get them back in the near future, is, in a way, just a way of getting attention to the fact that these are intractable issues which need a European and North American, ideally, commitment to long-term security for Ukraine instead of just looking for a way out of the war.
Right. And look, as you say, Keir, if a Ukrainian land was ceded to Putin, as you say, temporarily, it's very difficult to imagine in real terms, in the real world, that land ever returning to Ukraine, isn't it? I mean, Keir, what about Ukrainians who are in those Russian-controlled areas? I've heard it said that many of those people are pro-Russian, that that they may have left already if they were not. What do you say to that?
Well, I have been to Bucha and Irpin on the first days after liberation from Russian occupation, and we have seen what was happening in Izium and other territories. And, every time when our army was regaining some of the territories, they would find three things. First, it would be a mass grave. Second would be a torture room. And there would be women who suffered sexual violence. And this is basically what we are saying that people from the temporary occupied territories, we are leaving them to that. And this is not what can happen. And when we are discussing territories, it is very unfair, because when we are talking about some of the territories of Ukraine, we should be talking about people who are living there. First of all, older people, people who cannot move, people who don't understand why they should move somewhere where they lived their whole life just because Putin decided to start his war of aggression, and people who didn't have time to evacuate, etc. And right now they are under the occupation, and we should be discussing first and foremost always what's going to happen to people. And again, I don't think that our allies have a very good solution to that. It's very easy to say, oh, let's just leave it the way it is, let's accept the reality. But the reality is that there are people who are waiting that our army will come back, and because they were living their whole life in Ukraine, and there is nothing in the world that should be changing that.
So, I mean, Keir, you do not believe that any kind of deal of the kind that was, however tentatively sketched out by Volodymyr Zelensky, can work. You would not support such a deal.
There would be many discussions, and first and foremost, it will be a question of like, well, how did this deal looks like? Because as we discussed with you, John, the main question is how do we make sure that Russia would not attack us again? And I want to amplify that we have already been in a similar kind of deal in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up our nuclear weapons, second largest arsenal in the world, for the security guarantees. And look how it worked for us. So it's not a matter of me personally, it's a matter of Ukrainian people that we represent. And of how do we make sure that they are safe and secure. And right now, I do not see NATO coming saying, oh, we are ready to go into war with Russia for you guys. That's why the main question is still unanswered.
So, Keir, let's hypothetically consider that it might be possible for some deal to be struck in which the battle line is frozen and the areas under Russian control remain under Russian control. Now, part of that deal, as set up by Volodymyr Zelensky, would be that NATO would guarantee the security of the areas still in Ukrainian control. Can you conceive of NATO agreeing to that?
Well, first of all, John, on that earlier point of suggesting that people in that occupied zone under that savage military occupation can either become Russian or leave. You have to be very careful suggesting things like that, because effectively you're assisting Putin in his plan for ethnic cleansing by saying, yes, this is exactly what going to happen. But the other side of the equation, that call on NATO to do something, I think is highly unlikely to fly in NATO capitals. Now, the word that Volodymyr Zelensky, at this point he was talking Ukrainian, he said again and again, shvudko, this needs to happen swiftly. It needs to be an immediate solution to protect those areas of Ukraine that still remain free. NATO doesn't do things swiftly, let alone immediately. And there is nothing on the NATO side that has actually changed as a result of this new suggestion. So in effect, he's showing up the inability of the West to actually muscle up the will to protect Ukraine by putting forward this solution that he knows, I think, nobody is actually going to go for.
Yeah, you just don't believe that the outline proposal that was floated by Volodymyr Zelensky at the weekend, you just don't believe that could possibly fly.
Absolutely not. The United States and Germany have made it very plain that they do not support any kind of NATO plan for Ukraine. And this is a NATO plan which actually calls on NATO to do things far more rapidly than it's comfortable doing. So it's even more far-fetched than moving against US and German opposition before the most recent NATO summit.
Right. Now, Keir Rudy, what about the Ukrainian children who were abducted and removed from their families and from their homes by Russian forces? Would they not have to feature in some sort of agreement if there ever was one?
Well, John, it is such a painful subject. I want to remind everyone that the confirmation that more than 20,000 children were abducted, and the reality is that this number is much higher. This was the reason why International Criminal Court actually ordered an order for Putin's arrest. We are working with our international partners, including Turkey and Qatar, who are trying to help us to return those kids back. But in many cases, they have been placed into new families, and they will be raised as Russians, even having their live parents on our occupied or even on our territories. And this is just absolutely heartbreaking. There is not a good solution except of like diplomatic pressure onto Russia to return those kids. But and there are so many efforts that is happening from on different diplomatic channels, starting with the words, listen, these are kids. However, we understand that without the really fair peace, without uniting everyone into pressuring Russia by both military and diplomatic ways, it will be incredibly hard to let them reverse what they have done. We have seen this in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions that were temporarily occupied since 2014, and there were kids there who grew up since the occupation, and they are raising them as Russians, and many of them joined right now the Russian army. They were conscribed to fight against Ukraine. So it is a terrifying side of the war, and one of the war crimes that were committed and are being committed right now. Every time we hear that Russia is moving here or moving there.
I mean, Keir, the abduction of those thousands of Ukrainian children, it is a heartbreaking saga, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we mentioned just a moment ago the program of ethnic cleansing. This is an integral part of it, that absorption of these stolen children into Russia, giving them new identities, new stories about where they came from. If you're an 18-year-old Ukrainian, you're more likely to be conscripted into the army if you're in the occupied territories and grabbed by Russia than you are if you're actually in the free regions of Ukraine. It is a tragic element of this whole story. And sadly, it's one reason why that fair peace, that just peace that you mentioned a moment ago, is never actually going to happen for Ukraine. There is no way Russia can ever repay the damage it has done, the lives it has blighted, the people it has killed, the children, the innocents that have been maimed and whose futures have been destroyed. All of that cannot be repaid, no matter how much collective will there is from the West.
Keir, where does that leave Donald Trump's stated ambition of forcing an agreement when he becomes president?
Well, the sad news is, of course, that he may well be able to force through an agreement with cooperation from Vladimir Putin, because after all, it is in both of their interests. If Putin wants to, at a convenient moment, bring the major combat operations to a close in order to increase the speed at which Russia is regenerating its military for the next attempt, and if sufficient Western nations are willing to accept a ceasefire agreement as a fig leaf so that they can pretend yet again, as they have done in the past, in Georgia, in Syria, in Ukraine under the Minsk agreements, that the problem has been solved by the fighting coming to an end, then there will be little that can be done to actually oppose this. And it was only Ukraine that will be fighting on with whatever support it can garner from those countries in Europe that recognize what is really at stake.
All right, Keir Giles at Chatham House and Kira Rudik, Ukrainian MP in Kyiv. Thank you both.